students, today we'll be discussing the fundamental concepts in ancient Indian political thought. Now, as students of political science, we are all aware of Western political concepts and principles. We are aware of sovereignty, political obligation, diplomacy, international relations, punishment, law and justice, and we have all studied these as Western political principles. The objective of today's discussion is to familiarize you with the Indian conceptualization of these fundamental political concepts. For the convenience of our discussion, we would first understand the etymological and the literal meaning of these political principles, and then how the Indian theorists analyzed these principles. Now, we would be understanding the major political principles: sovereignty, political obligation, interstate relations, diplomacy, espionage, local self-government, law and justice, and punishment. We will try to understand how these popular Western political principles were applicable and conceptualized in the ancient Indian texts. Political science, as the science of government and state, was considered to be a discipline in ancient India also. It was known through various names: Rajniti, Niti Shastra, Raj Dharma, Artha Shastra, Dand Niti. There were various names for the politics of statecraft. And all these concepts actually circumscribed the various principles of governance. Now, politics in ancient India was spiritually and morally circumscribed by the principle of dharma. Political speculation, it is believed, as early as the Vedic civilization. Political precepts and principles have been considered to be an important tool of governance and statecraft. Let us start with the first political principle, sovereignty. We have studied about sovereignty, John Austin saying law as the command of the sovereign, or the concept of a determinate human superior. However, as a popular political principle, we know sovereignty refers to supreme power over citizens and subjects unrestrained by law. Now, we have seen that sovereignty has been variously described and analyzed by Jean Baudin, Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, and other political theorists. Now, let us try to understand, is this concept of supreme power over citizens and subjects was applicable in India? Now, what is the Indian version of sovereignty? Let us try to understand how various scholars who have studied and worked and interpreted the ancient Hindu texts have deciphered sovereignty. To V.P. Verma, the concept of sovereignty in the Western sense cannot be applied in India. Why? Now, to him, in the Western sense, sovereignty implied an absolute political superior. The need for a sovereign arose in the Western world because of the competing claims for supremacy by popes, aristocracy, and emperors. Contrasted with this situation, there was no conflict. And therefore, rival ideological protagonists for supreme political power never arose in India. It was presumed that king had supreme political power. However, Beni Prasad, another theorist, he is of the opinion that sovereignty does not imply the absolute unlimited powers of the king. It can at best described in terms of pluralism, primarily because of the existence of multiple associations in India during the ancient period. However, H.N. Sinha, in his seminal work, Sovereignty in Ancient Indian Polity, says that the concept of sovereignty, location of sovereign authority can be found. Sovereignty of the state is founded primarily on the power of the king to make and enforce laws, control religion, control group behavior. And it was believed that the king possessed sovereign power. In fact, in one of the texts, Narad Smriti, it has been said that the king has to maintain the established usage of the various social groups like that of outcasts, merchants, atheists, traders, tribal oligarchies, etc. Jaggobolko, in another Smriti, Jaggobolko Smriti, maintained that the king must discipline and establish on the path of their duty all such who have strayed from their own laws. It might be families, caste, guild associations, people of various districts. In fact, it was believed that the laws of the king had a binding force on everyone. And if the king had the power to impose his supremacy, it can be said to be sovereignty. Therefore, it can be deduced the sovereignty in ancient India was the sovereignty of the king. In fact, the king was considered to be the dispenser of justice, the maintainer of the social order, and therefore sovereignty could be effective only through a rashtra. The texts speak about the rashtra or the state, the supreme organization of the society. And because the king was considered to be the sovereign, he was considered to be the maker of the age. He was said to be a god in human form. And his supremacy was because he was the supreme arbiter of the entire society and kingdom. Now let's come to the second political concept, political obligation, which means why should we obey the laws of the state? What is the basis of our obligation towards the laws? In fact, the problem of political obligation is one of the most important issues of political philosophy. It is considered to be the basic problem of any civilized society. Should we obey all the laws of the state? Are the people justified in disobeying the norms? Now, there are various theories in the Western literature pertaining to political obligation. The three major theories are the theory of divine kingship, second, the theory of social contract, and third, the theory of force. There are other theories, but these three are the main theories. Now, let us try to see whether these political theories were found in ancient India or not. Let's start with the theory of divinity of the king. The king was considered to be a divine representative as per this theory. And therefore, because he was a divine representative, people had to obey the dictates of the king. The king was not accountable to anyone, and the people had to render absolute allegiance to the king. Now, in India, we find glimpses of this divinity of the king in the various scriptures. For example, in the Atharva Veda, the king is associated with Lord Indra. The Satpatha Brahmana identifies the king with Indra again. In one of the major quotes, it is said that the king rules and commands obedience because he is the representative of the supreme creator. In obeying the king, the people really obey Prajapati, the supreme creator. Therefore, king's divinity is definitely considered to be justification for people's allegiance towards laws. The Arthashastra also postulates the concept of king's divinity. It is said, whoever disregards the king will be visited with divine punishment. It is the king in whom duties of both Indra and Yama are blended. Therefore, the authority of the king has divine sanctions. The Mahabharata also speaks about divinity of the king. The king is divinely ordained to rule because he is a descendant of Lord Vishnu. No one should obey the king by taking him to be a man, for he is, in sooth, a great god in human form. Narad Smriti preaches that it is the duty of the subjects to submit to the king's commands. Whatever the king does is right. Therefore, the earlier scriptures do emphasize and acknowledge divinity of the king to be the basis for political obligation. Coming to the social contract theory. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau are the three major and popular advocates of the social contract theory in the West. They say that the contract is the basis of political obligation. Because there was a contract between the ruler and the ruled, political obligation emerged out of that. It was the result of an agreement. Now, the Mahabharata speaks about one such contractual obligation. It says, people do not need to render unconditional obedience to the king. The people have the right to revolt. If the king is unwilling or unable to carry out a part of the contract by protecting the people and ensuring a prosperous government, such a king has no right to rule, and such a king can be killed like a mad dog. Therefore, we find an understanding of a contractual obligation as the basis of obedience to laws. Coming to the third theory of political obligation, force. In the Western political theory, the basis of political obligation according to the force theory was might is right. Force is the basis of state. Individuals obey the state because they are forced to do so, they are compelled to do so. Hindu authors also attach a great deal of importance to force. That is danda. Danda is punishment. Danda signified the importance of punishment and coercion as the basis of obedience to the laws of the state. Arthashastra, Mahabharata, Manusmriti emphasize on the notion of dand. In fact, it is emphasized that dand alone enables the king to enjoy the earth and the subjects, to enjoy happiness. In fact, it is believed that it is the fear of punishment which enables the king to rule the state. Therefore, force as the basis of political obligation can be found in the ancient Hindu texts. Who can claim allegiance? Now, it has been emphasized in different texts that both the government and the citizens have to work in unison to make the political system a successful one. Rights of both the ruler and the ruled are complementary and not conflicting. In fact, the state in ancient India claimed absolute allegiance, primarily because there was no other civic or corporate body to rival the state. So the state claimed absolute political allegiance. Now let us come to the third fundamental concept: international relations, diplomacy, and espionage. In fact, this is a very, very important area in Hindu political thought. In fact, if you look into the protracted negotiations between the Kauravas and the Pandavas in Mahabharata, before the war actually started, speak about the importance of international relations, diplomacy. In fact, interstate relations have been emphasized in the Smriti and the Niti literature. A ruler is advised to be ever watchful. He should see the movements of his neighbors, ensure that peace and security prevails in his empire. In fact, there was a very popular custom in ancient times, the Ashwamedh Yagya. The king was supposed to perform the Ashwamedh Yagya if he wanted to be the ruler of a series of states. In fact, the king was supposed to engage himself in Dharma Vijay to ensure that acquisitions, expansion, conquering was a part of statecraft. Along with interstate relations, another important area of international relations was espionage. Kutniti. In fact, almost all scriptures emphasize the importance and significance of Kutniti. We have terms like Kuta Yuddh, diplomatic warfare. In fact, the rules of Kuta Yuddha permitted attack at any time and under all circumstances. There were definite rules of treatment of the enemy. In fact, one of the most interesting rules we speak about humane treatment was the fact that if a ruler of a neighboring kingdom laid down his arms and threw himself at the mercy of the conqueror, he was not to be slain or murdered. He was to be humanely treated. In fact, the word Duta has been analyzed in most of the texts. Duta in Sanskrit means messenger. There were three kinds of Dutas. One, who had full powers of negotiation, going to a neighboring kingdom, negotiating. The second category would just follow instructions from the king. The third would just go, gauge the situation, come back. He was not supposed to take an independent decision. In fact, Kautilya emphasized that spies were the eyes of the sovereign. They were to be designated by the sovereign to gather data from other kingdoms to ensure that the king had all information about foreign nations. Thus, they were dispersed throughout the kingdom to get internal information as well as to foreign countries to find out the nature of diplomacy as well as nature of political system in other countries. Now coming to how and why diplomacy was so important. Kautilya believed that diplomacy was a means to further self-interest of a nation, political, economic and military self-interest. It was a tool to expand power. And he said that kingdoms should always be at war or preparing for war. Diplomacy was not a static concept but dynamic. In fact, he believed that diplomacy was a series of moves made by a monarch to such an extent that it would help him to gather and garner power and vanquish the enemy state. So agreements were made in such a way that it always benefited the ruler. And Kautilya believed that diplomacy was an essential part of foreign policy. In fact, he believed that the 6 forms of foreign policy, peace, war, neutrality, alliances, double policy, marching, all these forms should be used by the ruler to ensure that the kingdom benefits and acquires neighboring territories, so much so that all the neighboring kingdoms should come within the fold of the Chakravartin. Not only Kautilya, Manu also discussed at length the concept of diplomacy and espionage. Manusmriti elaborates on the types and nature of interstate relations. In fact, the art of diplomacy was a major part of statecraft. He prescribes rules and strategies to be pursued by the king when he was facing an attack. In fact, he enunciates 6 forms of foreign policy: Sandhi, Vigraha, Asana, Yana, Samsarya, and Dvaidibhava. All these 6 forms of foreign policy would enable the ruler to maximize his self-interest. Manu believed that treaty making was a very important part of diplomatic relationship. And he believed that there are 3 objectives of treaty making. 1, acquisition of an ally, a friend. Acquisition of money and acquisition of land. Unlike Kautilya, Manu does not believe in territorial expansionism, but more of balancing power. Coming to the next fundamental concept is local self-government and village administration. Administrative system was decentralized, with the village being the lowest unit of administration. It was headed by the Gramika or Gramani. His position was hereditary, but students, by post he was a non-Brahmin. Defense of village, addressing the problems of the people were the main functions of the Gramika. He was also the custodian of records. Apart from the Gramik, there was also the village accountant with the task of corresponding with the district authorities, ensuring that problems are resolved. In fact, it is believed that the system of village administration was highly developed in ancient India. All respectable householders were entitled to become members of the local village assembly. They would come and discuss their local problems. One of the important functions of this village assembly was electing the village executive. Interestingly, students, the village executive was to comprise of people with certain qualifications. It is said that candidates aged between 35 years to 70 years, they should own a house and at least 2 acres of land. So this was the primary qualification for being a part of the village council. Now, what was the logic behind it? It was believed that persons who would deal with public funds should not be persons of need. Moreover, people who have been found guilty of misappropriation of funds can never become members of a local assembly. There were periodic elections, consensus of the local people was taken, and one important thing to note is that caste considerations did not play a role in the electing the village assembly. There have been records when non-Brahmins participated in the village council during the Gupta age, during the Maratha period, and not just non-Brahmins but also the lower caste could become members of the local assembly. Apart from general village administration, they were also entrusted with settlement of disputes. In fact, it is believed that they were also entrusted with judicial powers. Coming to the next important concept, law and justice. Now, students, in Western political theory, we know there are some major sources of law. For example, custom, religion, legislature, adjudication, commentaries by juries, precedents, these are the important sources of law. In ancient India, dharma was the basis of the legal system. Kautilya believed that there are 4 sources of law: scriptures, customs, reasons, and dictates of the king. In fact, almost all scriptures emphasize on dharma as the basis of the legal system. If there is a conflict between the legal text and dharma, it was dharma which would reign supreme. Now, dharma would encompass various kinds of laws. However, not just Kautilya, even Manu speaks about the importance of a well-crafted legal system, which he says Vivadapads. Manu speaks about 18 categories of laws. And if you look into these categories, students, they are so analytical and detailed, and you will find many of the areas to be highly contemporary. For instance, some of the categories of laws that Manu emphasized was non-payment of debts, deposit and pledge, concerns among partners, contracts, defamation, theft, robbery, violence, partition, gambling, duties of man and wife, adultery, betting. These are the important areas of laws. Now, what are the common features of the ancient Indian legal system? Now, law should conform to dharma. What was the purpose of law? The purpose of law was security and well-being of people. It was supposed to bring about social harmony, and customs formed an important part of the legal system besides dharma. An important part of the legal system, students, is punishment. Now, what is the purpose of punishment? Now, if you look into the Western theory, students, there are basically 4 important theories pertaining to punishment. One is the deterrent theory, second is the retributive theory, third is the reformative theory, and next is the preventive theory. We need to treat the criminal as a diseased person and reform him. put him on the right track. Now, what is the purpose of punishment? Manusmriti says that punishments have been prescribed by sages so that righteousness may not be outraged. People are on the right track. People follow the norms of dharma, and it should help the man to come to the right path. Let the criminal be reformed, but emphasis was also placed on the part that punishment should be as deserved, neither too lenient nor too harsh. Moreover, who possessed the power of providing punishment? The king, the state. The state was the enforcer of dand, punishment. But dand, punishment, should never violate the principles of dharma. Now let us see whether these theories of punishment, as is widely prevalent in the Western world, is applicable in India. Yes, in Mahabharata, punishment as retribution was present. The Mahabharata says to take revenge on him who takes revenge, to retaliate when struck, and to do harm in return for them. An eye for an eye. Another important purpose of punishment was the restraining principle. The purpose of creation of punishment, various kinds of punishments, was for checking the miscreant and the wrongdoers. What are the different kinds of punishment to be given to people, wrongdoers? Now, before we move on with the types of punishment, we need to know what are the circumstances or what are the points to be noted before punishment was given. It is noted that before awarding punishment, the judges, the king, should note the motive, the circumstances under which the crime was conducted, the nature of the crime itself, as well as the capacity of the criminal. Based on that, punishment should be awarded. Vaddanda, or capital punishment, was a form of punishment. Apart from capital punishment, there was arthadanda, which was fines. The third type of punishment was bhagdanda, or verbal punishment. And finally, moral disapprobation was another form of punishment. On the basis of a discussion of these fundamental concepts, we can come to the conclusion that popular Western political precepts can be found in ancient India. And these precepts are not just found in one or two texts, but most of the popular Hindu texts focus on modern Western principles. In fact, sovereignty, justice, international relations, political obligation, espionage, punishment, law and justice, all these were considered to be fundamental in the governance of the ancient Hindu political system.